Now, news of the imminent closure of Ndalo Media sent shockwaves in the media industry. Its founder and CEO, Kanye Dlomo, told staff this week the company will close its doors at the end of January 2019. Ndalo Media owns, among others, Al, Destiny and Destiny Man, but it's not the only media house which has been facing difficulty this year. We've got TV station, if you can remember, eNCA, as well as the New Age newspaper also closed their doors. So what's the state of the traditional media in South Africa? So to help us unpack this conversation, we're joined in studio now by William Bird. William is the director at Media Monitoring Africa. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me on the program.
Now, when we're looking at where print media is, you know, it has sent shockwaves through the industry, especially when it comes to the imminent closing of Ndalo Media. But surely that says something about where we're sitting as a country in terms of the fact that we're saying kids must go to school, go to university, study to be a journalist, but if they have no jobs within the industry in itself, then what are we exactly turning out?
So look, it's a real problem. I think that we're seeing globally the magazine market particularly being significantly reduced, and only those that have really got a big niche or those that have got very deep pockets being able to survive. And I think what makes this all the more tragic is that, you know, this was seen as one of South Africa's success stories, and to see them folding, everyone's going, oh my goodness, what on earth is going on here? Whereas in fact it's pretty much in line with global standards and global trends. We do see that smaller media particularly are caught in this double bind where they're being told you have to move digital, you have to do all things digital, it's wonderful and it's the future, which there's no question it absolutely is. But at the same time they go, well, where's the money coming from? And when they look at that, the sums just don't add up. So we really are placing all of our media in South Africa in this really difficult position where we're getting more people in, but they've got less resources. We've got a more complex story in South Africa to tell every day. So we need these skills. So the desperate need for quality journalism is there, for diversity is there, and yet the financial models for those things have been completely obliterated over the last few years, and we're not seeing anything yet that's really starting to show us any real alternative.
Yeah, but then, William, would you say that perhaps even South Africa and the modus operandi is that we're a third world country operating with first world ambitions when it comes to media and how we run our newsrooms, and therefore we have to be confronted with the realities, especially around diversification of the media industry. As you would know, social media now has given birth to new forms of journalism, which is instant, now, and on the move.
So look, it has been a challenge for our traditional media to respond to those, but make no doubt, you want to be following and trusting legitimate, trusted sources on social media, precisely because you can pretend to be anyone on social media and put out almost any story. How do you determine what to believe? You know, because you go to brands that have trusted, credible entities that, despite their faults, of which our media have many, we know that you can, broadly speaking, trust what they put out. So that's the first dilemma. I think the second is that you're not seeing any kind of alternative revenue stream coming in for those smaller media. And yet, in response to your question, we've got success stories in South Africa where you've got small commercial media entities operating in South African communities where the community is deeply impoverished, there are no resources, there's hardly anything going to support and sustain the community, and yet their community radio or their community newspaper is surviving. And you have to say, well, what's going on there? There's something really interesting going on there, and I think that we need to be focusing more on what are those models and seeing how we can do them.
Yeah, so perhaps looking at how we need to be more or be more lateral in terms of our approach to the media industry, so that, when it comes to Ndalo, for example, Ndalo's story is not the only story that is out there. Now there's a New Age newspaper. Is that maybe we should be chasing stories that are more local, and therefore community members are able to buy in, not only to the institution, but really to the journalists who are writing the stories, covering the stories that they want to see or they want to listen to, as opposed to us stretching our nets and having a national approach to it, which then ends up in situations where we can't fit the bill for it.
I think that's part of it, and ultimately the flip is this, is that instead of selling audiences to advertisers, we've got to flip that completely and say, of what value is what we're putting out useful to our audiences, our users and our publics? The moment you start to get that and you switch that equation, then you start to offer something that's completely different. So if you start to say, what value is this newspaper in this community of value to them, they say, well, they're the only one who cover our issues. So we saw with the New Age, their model was we get a lot of funding from government,
and then we
this is the way we get it. And the moment that falls apart, their whole model fell apart, which we've just seen, you know. And then you've got the traditional commercial model, which is something Ndalo and many others follow, is that you rely on advertisers, and the moment that pool starts to dry up, then you have a big problem.
Yeah.
And so what you've got to be doing is saying, well, what's really starts to have real meaningful value for our audience.
But then how do you mitigate that? I mean, and I'm seeing this as a way of us finding solutions to these existing problems, but should we be looking at digitizing, right, all of our media? And in that case, then, what does that say about the cost of actually getting access to that information? Because going digital is no cheap manner, never mind for the consumer, but even for the people that have to turn out that very same information.
Well, exactly. It's why those with the bigger pockets and the deeper pockets and the entities and the structures are likely to survive, whereas those in the smaller areas are likely not to, precisely because eNCA, they've got big holding company behind them, big shareholders. They're able to survive these kinds of shifts, to shift to digital, to make sure to start to say, well, how do we offer new things? Whereas people in communities, they say, go digital, but then their communities are saying, well, we can't afford to spend this much on data, on getting access to these things.
Yeah.
So the smaller media, in other words, the element of diversity, really are caught in this impossible situation. And I think that's where we need to be looking to say, well, what are those media managing to do that are surviving? In these impossible circumstances, what are they doing? What can we take from that, and how do we replicate those models? Because there are people that are doing this in our country. I mean, and they're amazing individuals and small teams, and they are small teams of people that are doing these things. How do we replicate that so that we don't see more of these big success stories failing? Because make no error, the people that are succeeding in these small things, they aren't part of the big successful formerly white.
Well, they don't have a formal PR company to actually, blow the horn about it. And speaking about PR companies, it's the question about what happens to the journalists now. And a study was showing that more and more reputable journalists, or even senior journalists, are going the more corporate communications route. So they're taking on the route of being either part of a PR company or forming a corporate communications structure. Is that what we're going to be finding in the future, that we're going to be turning out journalists so that they can write PR campaigns?
Well, what we've seen, I think, and unfortunately we don't have the same stats for South Africa, but we've seen in the States, for example, there are now 4 times the number of PR people as there are to journalists. So you think about what that does to a model of who spreads the news and of who understands what our understanding of it is, and that says this is a problem for our democracy, actually. So that is the global trend. It's not unique to South Africa, and we have to say, well, how on earth do we combat this? Because
should we be combating it?
We have to, because despite their limitations, the media are the 4th pillar of democracy. Without an independent media that is able to help us understand and comprehend the deep and complex problems that we have from different and diverse perspectives, and hold the various power holders to account, you can't have a democracy. In other words, you can't ever have a real democracy without an independent media that is able to hold the powerful to account. Those things are interdependent with each other. And so for us to say we're going to continue to build our democracy, we have to make sure we build our independent media. And that means, for example, that we have to make sure that our public broadcaster succeeds. Why? Because it's the single biggest example of an entity that is able to maintain and report in the public interest so that it can sustain private media, ironically, like eNCA.
Well, William, before I let you go, I think the big question now is, if we do not find the solution to the current existing problem, are we going to be seeing more and more journalists wanting to find opportunities outside of the country?
Well, there's no doubt. I mean, the trends for the last nearly decade are exactly that. We're seeing a lot of journalists now becoming freelancers, operating as different sort of independent entities, reporting for different media. And that's, I think that works for them, but we do need to make sure that we continue to build and invest in quality journalism, because without it, you can't have a democracy.
Well, there it is. Without it, we can't have a democracy. Thanks a lot for joining us for this conversation on Newsnight. William Berthe giving us the latest in terms of exactly what is happening to our traditional forms of media.